I can see all of your thinking hats behind you, so
Well, that's
I
a
know it's
generous,
I know it's you and not an imposter.
yeah, that's a generous way to describe it. Thinking hats. And I
Yeah.
also still have my horse shaped birthday balloons. So
Oh, look at that. Happy birthday.
thank you. Yeah, I just went over the hill. I, I like your studio.
Oh, thank you.
Uh,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
look like, I don't know, like the mentor figure in like a superhero movie, right? You know, you step into the room. Right, right. You know,
There's a reason I brought you and your magical horse balloons.
exactly. Well,
The
it's
world is at a crossroads and we need your help.
this kind of sounds like the start of a Dan Brown novel, actually. Yeah.
It does.
Although already better written.
Yeah. Well, I'll meet you in just south of Edinburgh to discuss the next phase of our operation.
All right. Yeah. If I'm not attacked by sharks before then. Well, it's really cool to talk to you directly. I mean, I was in the Zoom call with the whole map class uh,
Yeah.
in January, but and that was a lot of fun, by the way, and inspired, as you know, uh, something I did myself for my own book.
Yeah.
Um, I thought, why don't we get started with you just telling us a little bit about like how did you wind up teaching people how to draw maps?
Oh, great. Oh, are we on already? I didn't even realize. I thought this was a little behind the scenes before. So we're all here together.
Oh, I am. There are a few Patreon supporters here. There's
Yeah.
folks who might be curious about what we've got to talk about here. Let me make sure that chat is on for everybody if they want to use
Okay.
it.
Let me open up the chat window over here.
And yeah, I should have turned it on earlier. Yeah, I mean, I am so just laid back about how I do these things. Like I figure that it's a way to talk to people about what they do,
Mhm.
basically just have a conversation. There's people listening, but don't feel any pressure about it. It's not like we're live with a CNN camera or anything.
Yeah,
And
no.
and I became more and more interested in talking to you after I read your book
Oh, right. Yeah.
and thank you for sending me this, by the way, because it
My
really
pleasure.
was uh, hard to find.
Yeah.
Um, as you can perhaps see, I dog-eared the hell out of it on both ends, which is a really good sign,
Yeah.
because I am worse to books that I like most. So,
I I'm there right there with you. Like
so
whether or not I actually do like this book, I've done a fair amount of damage to it too over the years.
huh.
Yeah. This is actually specifically my reader's copy, the one that whenever I sort of read from it, I read from this specific copy. So it has tons of notes and drawings and post-publication edits and vandalism by my daughter years and years ago.
That's pretty cool.
So there's a lot of like physical history to this, just as in this room that I'm in. There's like all of these sort of totemic objects that point back to
S-
specific
So
experiences, tales.
keep that thought in mind because I just wanted to say something related to it and I want to come back to it.
Yeah.
One thing that both I and my fiance, who read at least a lot of this, I don't know if she finished it, but she took a great interest in it. She's from New York
Oh, my
and from
condolences.
Queens.
Oh, great. My wife also is, but spent many decades in Queens before we met.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, she was remarking on how rooted in place it was, right? She said she could really kind of feel the setting, right? The place that had inspired it. And one of my favorite things about any writer is feeling like they're in a place, right? I mean, so much of what we do today is placeless, right? It's
Mhm.
nowhere.
Right.
And, whether or not I have any knowledge or appreciation of a given place, I think that the best poets evoke that place, right? I mean, you can't read Robinson Jeffers without picturing the California coast. You can't read Robert Frost without picturing well, New England in grand in general. And even a lot of novelists are great at this too, even if they're not
Mhm.
explicitly citing something in, like this took place in whatever Massachusetts, you can still kind of feel the setting.
Right.
So you just mentioned, you're kind of surrounded by totemic things.
Yeah.
So can you talk about, it feels to me that this is sort of at the root of a lot of your pursuits is place, right?
Mhm.
Not only your writing, but also your maps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start by saying, we sort of made joked about Dan Brown at the very outset. I think he's fantastic.
Right.
It's like a guilty pleasure, but I love his writing. It works and it gets the job done. And I still think of all the different like settings, and specifically there was when and I'm answering your question in a kind of roundabout way, but there is a scene that takes place just south of Edinburgh in Scotland, not far from where Julie C is in the Lake District in UK. I mean, somewhat far, but and we almost went to visit it specifically because of Dan Brown's book, and then we decided not to because we were told by people who live in the area, like, yeah, it's really the book portrays it very differently than what it's become because of the book.
Um,
Um, but having said that, yes, like I there is definitely a very strong sense of place and environment within my writing, and that comes about in some ways because like I think of myself as being somewhat cursed, right? Because I um I've my entire life have been drawn to visual art and to writing as two different kind of callings or vocations or whatever. But it's two different poles. There's some overlap in the climates from one to the next, but nevertheless, anytime I'm working on writing, I'm also thinking visually, and
mhm.
anytime I'm working on a visual piece, I'm thinking sort of textually. And how that plays out in both my visual art and in my writing is that my the maps that we'll kind of maybe touch on in a little bit in more detail are very much about storytelling, and the writing that I work on, especially my poetry, is very environmental, and not just in the sense of, oh, this is about like the California coast or something like that, but it's creating itself an environment that you, as the reader, can kind of pass through a sort of conceptual environment in the same way that, like, rather than a piece of prose like a Dan Brown novel where you're like, okay, I want to see what's going to happen next. Like you're being carried along by the characters and the plot and the narrative. In typically in the kind of writing that I do, um, it's more akin to walking down a city block and noticing what you notice. So rather than saying, "Oh, this poem is about this," it's more like it like describing one of the pieces that I write in that way doesn't necessarily make sense any more than it would be to describe like a city block as being about a specific thing. Like there might be dominant experiences that you have as you walk down that block, but it's not necessarily about that. There's a lot of things happening.
That's very
And
nicely put. Yeah, I mean, and this is actually something that I think comes up a lot with any given writer. Certainly, I mean, I'm not really an artist of any sort, but like the closest thing I am is like to a writer, right? So people always say, well, like, so what is your book about,
right,
right? We
right.
always want to know what is the book about, or often if we look at especially a more abstract visual piece,
Mhm.
a sculpture or a painting, what is this about?
Right.
But perhaps it just evokes an experience.
Right. I'm always more interested in not what is it about, but what happens inside of this thing, and
Hmm.
or what does it do? There'll be like 9 times out of 10, I will write a poem that nobody else on the planet will ever read because I'll look at it after I'm done with it, and I'll just be like, oh, this poem actually it's clever, or it evokes certain things, but it doesn't actually do anything. Like
Hmm.
your time could be better served, watching a true crime documentary, or just like spending an extra couple of minutes like in the shower in the morning and not like there's anything would be a better use of your time than reading this poem that doesn't do anything.
That is a bar to clear. So, so you're saying that this is a percentage of what you've produced. This is very curated then.
Oh yeah, and that actually that book is 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 the distilled work of about 20 years. You know, when I'm feeling kind of snarky and somebody asks what it's about, I'll say, it's about, I don't know, 120 pages.
Yeah.
Um, so it's very distilled. Um, there's there's a lot of work that I sort of liked, but it was not quite working yet, and it didn't go into the book
Mhm.
because I didn't want to waste anybody's time. And also I know we actually do have a lot of demands on our attention. And 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 if I feel like a poem is not gonna hold your attention, or not gonna be worth holding your attention, then I don't want you to worry about having to look at it.
I
You
respect
know,
that a lot. I
yeah.
mean, that is a discipline and like a Brahms level discipline to say, this is right. I mean, that's the first person that comes to mind when I think of someone who's just that hard on filtering his own work.
Yeah.
Uh, to say, I've produced this, maybe I could make something out of it, but no, this isn't worthy of my audience. I mean, it's actually a very humble attitude, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. I mean, anytime I think like, and this is not just me, but I feel like most writers that I speak to, like in like especially poets who do, pretty frequent readings, like they will almost everybody has had at least once and more often most of the time in the hours leading up to a reading while they're kind of going through their new work, deciding what to present to whoever shows up. They realize, oh, I hate everything I've ever written.
Yeah.
There was a poet I went to a reading just recently, just last week, and there was somebody who like very openly expressed that feeling that she was having, and and there's sort of usually when somebody does a reading, at some point towards the end of the reading, they'll be like, okay, I've just got two more, and she was like, okay, I have just one more, and then I'm just going to leave you alone.
I understand. I mean,
Yeah.
part of it is, of course, our own favorite writer's work is always going to be kind of echoing in our heads to some extent.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that feeling that this is not worthy of sitting on the shelf next to, Wendell or
Right.
something. It's like, yeah, this is not worth people's time the same way. Yeah, I understand. Although often I find that it's some of the better poets who are that self-critical, right? Um,
Right.
you, you
So
do.
it could be argued that the best writer ever is somebody who's never published anything and never will.
That may be true.
Because
Yeah,
they're
actually,
that discerning.
I wouldn't be that shocked by it. And I mean, at any rate, so many people are never appreciated in their lifetime. And
Yeah.
that problem is probably compounded today by the way that writing is marketed.
Hmm.
Everything is marketed as you is just what's proven. Uh,
Right.
you
Right.
don't get a lot of experimental or new anything marketed to you. And now that probably already our books compete on the shelves with things written by machines, machines are always going to do something safe, right?
Right.
Because they're programmed based on what's safe.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like ultimately the writing that I do comes out of a desire to like set up a certain set of lenses to look at experiences through, to look at like innate structures and relationships through a sequence of lenses, either for a sustained period of time or maybe just for one sonnet. And so the experience is then for me is as sort of the practitioner, to see what's going to happen, in the work and in my mind as it goes, and and with with something like poetry or other kind of more experimental work that is published by small presses, just by the nature of it, it's going to have a smaller audience of people that are drawn to it, and marketing tends to not really work that well, like
Mm.
in terms of that. Like we're not necessarily like it's not gonna work to have a work of experimental poetry, like language poetry or something like that, on Oprah, like because the audience that comes to it is not going to they're not necessarily going to respond to it. It's not going to be like their cup of tea. Uh,
Hmm.
and and
That's what,
so
or
yeah,
so
go
they
ahead.
think. I mean,
It's
that's,
true. I mean, it then, it like I was probably introduced to kind of weird experimental writing through Gertrude Stein and John Ashbery. Gertrude Stein from like an earlier modernist tradition, and John Ashbery as sort of a practitioner of sort of quasi New York school meets the proto language poetry, which were kind of like movements within like mid late 20th century American poetry. And we can talk about that a little bit if we want to, because I feel like your viewers and listeners are probably somewhat interested in sort of the etymology and the development of things from, okay, how did this thing come to be? Well, before this was this, and then that was in
yeah.
reaction to this. Um, and but but I was introduced to this sort of strange, outlandish approach to writing, where things weren't necessarily being described and there wasn't necessarily a plot. Um, and initially I was pretty resistant to it because it I didn't really have an entrance into it. And I read an essay probably like 30 years ago. I don't remember who wrote it, but an essay about John Ashbery's writing. And and the argument of it was just that pleasure itself is a kind of understanding. Um, that you may have no idea what it is you're reading, but you're really digging it, and that itself is a form of understanding of the experience. Um, and that kind of led to more of an open-mindedness that allowed me to feel more relaxed entering into the work, and then be able to really begin to make other connections within it.
Hmm. And that's an interesting term that you use, be more relaxed going into it. I think that sometimes we go in with the expectation that there's some, I don't know, there's some judge listening to what we're reading to ourselves and
Yeah,
trying to intervene and say, well, no, that's not good. You don't need to continue this.
absolutely. And and that goes back to like being judgmental of your own work and not wanting to, you know, share it with anybody because you don't want to waste their time. At the same time, there's this wealth of traditions, like you talked about, like Wendell Berry and you had a Professor Tim Hunt on a while
Mhm.
back, talking about Robinson Jeffers, and they come from like specific traditions, um, and but there are so many traditions that we're sort of existing in a sea of now, in in the 21st century, that we have ready access to. And just from like my interaction with you, now I'm thinking more about like Old Norse poetry and in a way that I might not have before, just because we've now crossed paths. I'm going to be like, oh, okay, let me investigate what's going on in
Hmm.
in contemporary Norse poetry and in ancient Norse poetry, um, and how can that be pulled into the kind of work that I'm doing. But there are all these traditions. There's a school I almost went to, not far from where you're at, in Boulder, Colorado, um, the Naropa University.
Yeah, I know Naropa, yeah.
And specifically the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics within Naropa, that was founded by Anne Waldman and Allen Ginsberg, and and was initially, very much sort of coming through sort of beat traditions that emerged in like the 1950s in the US. And then subsequent to that, like it became informed by what's kind of colloquially known as the New York School, which which was people like John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, Kenneth Koch, and a host of others, and that emerged as a kind of response against the beats in some ways. The beats themselves emerged as a response against kind of new formalism that was sort of the dominant form of sort of approaches to poetry after World War II. And that was very much like that was that that embraced sort of formal qualities like, okay, we're going to write sestinas and sonnets, and we're going to kind of evoke a sort of bygone era linguistically and in terms of our prosody. Um, and the Beats responded like, actually, no, we're going to, we're living in a very sort of hypocritical, disrupted moment in history in the 50s, where anything aberrant had to be very much done in secret and closeted and was disparaged. Um, and like anything that deviated from what was perceived to be the norm. And so you have these much more sort of visceral, seemingly almost anti-intellectual if the like the formalists of the 40s and early 50s were taken to be sort of the intellectual standard of the day. Um, so I say seemingly anti-intellectual because actually they were very smart and informed by a really profound understanding of prosody and the structures of language. Um, and but um, but very visceral and kind of disruptive politically. And then in the 60s, the New York School began to emerge as a response against that, and that was very much like they brought in more sort of like wit and charm and what was sort of perceived to be more like cocktail party conversationalism within the work. And and then in the 70s, what was known as language poetry began to emerge, and um, that was a sort of radical departure from either of those because they got rid of or they foregrounded the sort of nature of language itself or the texture of language itself at the expense of describing a scene or a set of ideas using sort of more traditional language, conversational language.
Could you give us
And
an example of that? Because
um,
what is the when you say foregrounding language, like how do you mean?
okay.
What?
Um, So, like the conversation we're having now, there's a set of expectations of like, okay, I'm speaking in sentences, and they might be somewhat kind of disrupted here and there because we're having a conversation and people speak in a way that they don't actually put on, when they're writing something written down.
Hmm.
But for the most part, you understand like I'm going to say a sentence. It's going to have a subject, a verb, an object, and so forth, and there's going to be, an arc to the point I'm trying to make. And with language poetry, the like those norms were broken apart, and and poets began doing um, more experiments with the individual units of language itself. Like I'm just going to write something. I'm going to remove all verbs from this piece,
Hmm.
and and um, And if I had a more scholarly mind, I could like sort of pull from the ether right now some specific quotes.
Oh, I can never do that either.
Yeah. Um, but Charles Bernstein is and remains a great practitioner of this, and they actually started they started a reading series at a bar in like in Tribeca, and it's a sort of far downtown neighborhood in New York, called a place called the Ear Inn in the 70s. A reading series that continues to this day. it's moved to various venues, and now is under the auspices of an organization called the Segway Foundation, that continues to publish a lot of this really great material. And along with like other sort of the infiltration of other traditions. And but I say I almost went to Naropa, and I ended up staying in New York and going to Brooklyn College to get an MFA in poetry. In part because Brooklyn College at the time was free, essentially, um, and uh, and uh, and the Brooklyn College program was it was really wonderful in a lot of ways. But one of the ways it was wonderful was that it was founded by two poets who came from very different traditions. It was founded by John Ashbery, who was again more experimental with their approach to language and kind of came from the sort of experimental end of the New York school, and Allen Ginsberg. And and this story might be totally apocryphal, but I'll tell it anyway, which is that the legend has it is that they had sort of an uneasy truce as they were forming the program and running the program together, where where John Ashbery said, yeah, Alan's work is, it's great. I don't really understand why he keeps writing the same poem over and over again for decades now. But I mean, it's a good poem, but maybe he should try writing a different one. And Allen Ginsberg was like, I understand that John's work has some sort of cultural value, but the only way I can come to understand what it is he's trying to do is to just believe that he probably has something physically wrong with his brain. Like it's not just like mental illness, but there's something in the structure of his brain that is preventing him from writing like a normal human being. So they liked and respected each other, but according to this story, they also, sort of took the piss out of each other.
Well, I mean, at least creatively.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
And that was a story told secondhand by somebody else who worked in the program. So maybe totally made up, but now because it's on your podcast, it's canon.
Oh, I don't think I have any canon establishing powers. But one of the things I was thinking about,
Yeah.
sort of disrupting your history here, though, is how often is it possible? Because it seems like, to a certain extent, language poetry is trying to evade some of the ways we standardize our expression based on the fact that we're communicating largely by the written word when we publish,
Mhm.
and trying to get back to something a little bit more like the stream of consciousness that might come from just my internal monologue or just the dialogue between two people without observing any kind, like trying to capture, in a sense, the ingenuity of text that's not supposed to be printed.
Right. I think, yeah, go ahead. Oh,
So,
no, go ahead. Finish the thought.
okay, so I may or may not be right in taking the message there, but I've wondered sometimes if, not even talking about, ancient Norse poetry as such, but thinking about, one of the things that I deal with and teach about, in fact, I'm starting a class about this today that I'm teaching on Zoom, is runic inscriptions, right? So sometimes we understand this message that was carved by somebody 1500 years ago, 2000 years ago, in terms of we understand what word that is, but we have no clue why like, what? Like what is this? It's not a memorial to somebody. It's not, as far as we can tell, like a magic spell or something. It's just like somebody's name and some random word. And I've wondered if a culture that's just recently picked up writing with no expectation of what writing is supposed to be for is,
Yeah.
in a sense, doing something like what you're talking about. Just like, oh yeah, this is what was on somebody's mind, and they were just idle and
I
chipped
mean,
this into a piece of rock or whatever.
that could be the case. I think it's I mean, that's really interesting that with like runic structures that it was like there weren't set rules yet of what written language was going to be. And so they were establishing the rules just by doing things. And but I think it's a common misconception that like experimental writing is just sort of stream of consciousness or
Mm,
anything goes or because actually it can be quite the opposite. It's it there I think within both language poetry, where we have these sort of experimental operations and constraints that are set up. It can be very systematic, and and similarly with something like beat poetry, you have it can have like when it's really working, it can have this sort of immediacy to it, like with something like Allen Ginsberg's Howl or Kaddish, but part of that immediacy is that there are structures at play within it, either older structures or sort of novel structures that were developed just for this specific piece,
mm.
but sort of guiding behind the scenes principles of prosody, like sort of a metric system, like Allen Ginsberg. He he was kind of he was really well versed in prosody, in the structures of language, of understanding metric systems, and a lot of his work is in what he calls American sentences, which is great deal of it is iambic. The lines tend to have 17 syllables, which, like the iambic pentameter, which was the sort of basis of like Shakespearean writing and a lot of sort of Western poetry, is the iamb, which is is based on the human heartbeat, but like through generations of intellectualization, that kind of got sort of lost in the mix and just became like, well, that's how you're supposed to write. And so a lot of Allen Ginsberg's work was taking the iamb, removing it from this constraint of having 10 syllables or 5 metric feet, and replacing it with what he called American sentences, which was essentially the length of one of his breaths.
Mm.
So reconnecting it to actual like present physicality of the the person and the sort of bardic tradition of speaking poetry aloud, even if it's going to be written on the page, of connecting it to both the heartbeat on one side and the breath on the other. Um, so,
And
but earlier sort of modernist and Dada and surrealist poets would we're doing more sort of stream of consciousness, and it was a little bit more anything goes because anything goes hadn't really been quite done yet in that way, and it was sort of groundbreaking at that sort of historically located moment.
sure, and I should clarify that when I said stream of consciousness, I didn't mean it as a
Oh no,
diss,
no, I
as the
know,
kids
I
used
know.
to say.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and for that matter, I also one major disclaimer I should make about any sort of discussion of poetry, or for that matter, runic inscriptions, is I never assume when I don't see a pattern that there's not a pattern.
yeah.
Right. One of the things that drives me crazy, and runes are just on my mind because I've been preparing this class. One of the things that drives me crazy about, reading people's interpretations of runic inscriptions is so many commentators will fall back on this. Well, they didn't know what they were doing. This is just somebody making lots of mistakes. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I feel like people mostly when they commit something to stone, they do kind of know
Right.
what they want to do. So I generally presume that there's a pattern that I just can't see, and I
Mhm.
definitely take it the same way with scansion because
Mhm.
you know, I translate into free verse, but it's not anything goes, right?
Right.
I mean, like so I've been accused of not scanning. Like, well, you just don't see how I mean it to be scanned, right?
Mhm.
Like, no, it's not iambic pentameter, but
Right.
like there's still there's a prosody to it. And the same way, you look at, well, I'll just bring up Jeffers again because he's someone that examples readily leap to mind. There is often a prosody there.
Yeah.
Robert Frost, there is often something like it's not necessarily again da 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 da, but there's often some kind of structure.
Yeah, I'm like glancing over at the chat window, which has been very lively while all this has been going on too. Um, and uh, and and to your point, Julie was just saying that at a reading that Ginsberg gave many years ago, he would occasionally, where he was translating something, he would every now and then say, "Oh, this is untranslatable," um, which which may have been the case, or was probably the case in terms of like, well, you can't translate that without stopping the reading and going into like a 20-minute exegesis of like the broader context of what this word might actually mean.
That is a challenge of translation sometimes. She does
Yeah.
say imaginary translation, so maybe it's not.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Maybe it was all sort of a ruse. But like I am not the most well-read reader of poetry in the world. It's not, certainly 20th, 21st century poetry is not an academic focus of mine. Um, so there is a lot of variety out there that I don't know about. I didn't know, for example, about, the language poetry as such as a school. Okay, that's new to me.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm very interested in it, right? I'm interested in what people do with language, right? And I want to look at it with good faith and say, what is the experience that I'm meant to take out of this?
Right.
What is the experience of language, not just the experience of a message that I'm supposed to take out of this?
Right. Right. And language, like in terms of when I said foregrounding the texture of language, I think one of their initial dominant missions was to challenge the notion that language itself is transparent. Like it's it's a strange art form, poetry, because we're using this medium that is typically used in the way that we're using it right now, just to have a conversation, to convey information back and forth and share ideas. Um, and and so unlike like the way we perceive paint right now, which is like painting is a specific medium where we don't necessarily expect 100% of the time, like, oh, it's going to be you're trying to represent, a bowl of fruit with some flowers next to it on a table, or a landscape. Like there's degrees of ambiguity and abstraction in painting that we just take as a given. But with language, in general, the assumption is, oh, you're trying to tell me something specific. You're trying to
Mhm.
convey some information, and the language you're using is transparent. It's just a mechanism for conveying this idea. And the language itself, you don't even see the language. You're just seeing the idea that the language is a medium for. And with language poetry and other forms of experimental work, it's saying, wait, hang on a second. Let's actually look at the canvas itself and the medium itself rather than what these things are expected to convey. And be aware of the fact that here is here is language and is always doing things other than just telling you a story.
Mhm. And in fact, it occurs to me that a lot of Old Norse poetry is somewhat similar in refocusing you on the medium rather than the message. Uh,
Yeah.
so skaldic poetry, which was poetry intended for a court audience, right? Typically, it's
Mhm.
one stanza of about eight. Usually, it's one stanza of 8 lines, and it's in praise of a king or a friend, or it's usually praise poetry.
Mhm.
Um, it aggressively, addictively does not say what the poet means, right? It is just that as a school, it is addicted to kennings, right? These sort of elusive metaphors that build in, like what you're what you're really talking about is usually disguised by at least two levels. So, for example, if I want to talk about a raven, instead of saying raven, I say some other bird. I
Mhm.
say gosling or cuckoo or something. And then I suggest what I'm really talking about by using a word that brings to mind ravens, but it might be a very distant relationship, right? I might say Odin's gosling or Odin's cuckoo or the the dark blue cuckoo or something like that, or the gosling that drinks blood.
Mhm.
Um, but then you can, take blood and make a kenning for that, right? So blood then is the wine of the battlefield. So, what is the battlefield's wine's gosling? And then you have to figure out that what they're talking about is the raven. So they also, in probably a pre-literate environment, are playing with language. And what strikes me is not the same way, but also a way that draws your attention to the language itself, to the medium itself.
So, but are there theories as to why they were doing that? Like like
Well, I
rather
mean,
rather than just saying, yeah, here's what I want to tell you. to set up these sort of brain teasers or
Well, their meters are very, very strict.
Mhm.
So typically within that 8 line stanza, you have these syllables and these lines have to alliterate, and these syllables have to fully rhyme, and these syllables have to half rhyme. So you take just a simple message, hawk on is so cool, and then
Mhm.
you have to figure out how to make that alliterate and rhyme in all the right places. And so part
Right.
of doing that is playing around with the words to get words that will rhyme with each other and such.
And
Now, where did that impulse come from?
well, there's like the skill involved too. I imagine if they were court writers or performers, it would enable the royal family or whoever was at the top of the hierarchy to say, look at this person in my court and the massive, like they are so much more skilled than over, across on the other side of that mountain, and they're lame court with that
Yeah,
guy.
I think that's true. I think part of it is bragging rights.
Yeah.
Of course, where does the impulse come from in the first place? How does that become the thing? Well, why is super strict meter and then such
Mhm.
elusive, and I mean that ELUSIVE and also ALL,
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
what poetry, like why does that become such a prized thing, right? I'm not sure what the impulse originally is.
Right, right. Um, not sure either.
Yeah. But, I don't think that usually you can necessarily pinpoint some
Mhm.
historical chain of events that makes that kind of thing
Right,
happen.
right, right. Um, so, so, so we have. I'm looking over back at the chat window there. So we have the poems that I kind of write as environmental experiences, and then we have the visual art that I create, these maps. And I don't know if like we had talked beforehand about maybe I could read a poem or two
Yeah, please.
if that's something that would be interesting to you, interesting to.
I would love to have you do that. And I'm also going to make you co-host so that if you would like to share your screen to show any images or something that you'd like to, you can.
Okay, yeah, I think if we segue from that into the map making, which I have over here,
And
um,
and before you read, could we also, I don't know that I showed the book clearly.
yeah,
How on earth can people find this if they don't have you to send it to them?
that's a very good question. This book came out in 2018, and there were about 500 copies printed, which is a healthy number of copies for a poetry book, and I think I have about 20 left.
Okay.
But I think through regular distribution channels, they've kind of evaporated,
Yeah.
um, which happens. Like most of these poetry books on the shelves behind me here are in similar situations. Like if you want to read a copy of one of those books, you probably should come over to my house, and you can sit in that purple chair back there, and you can go through them. Um, but yeah, you would probably just have to reach out to me,
Okay. Okay.
which people are welcome to do. Or if they want like a fuller experience, I read my poetry definitely in New York, and when people invite me to read elsewhere, I'll fly out and do a reading someplace else, and I'll usually bring a few copies with me.
Okay.
Um, but the scale on which, like the fact that this book had any sort of distribution for however brief period of time, it puts it into a sort of coveted spot within within the small press world. Like there are poets who publish with universities, and there's sort of long established distribution chains that tend not to go away with those. But with small presses, um, having a distributor, having them available in bookstores, and both physical bookstores and online bookstores, is really fantastic to even arrive at that level because most books are just sort of they get published and then they get sold directly from the person who published them and from the person who wrote it, and that's about it. Which adds to the sort of personal level of interaction. Like so much of so much of what led me to writing and it's also led me to making these maps is so that situations can arise like this one right here that we're living in this specific moment where where I get to meet interesting people and have kind of cool experiences and on a sort of very personal level. Like I'm working on a manuscript right now. This is what will maybe someday look like something in this form.
Oh, very nice.
Um, and this is called Works in Person because that's the way a great deal of all of this stuff that we're doing is working.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, and I like the way that you turn that into, or not even turn it into, but the way you frame it as a positive, right? I mean, like if you want the experience of talking to the author, you can get the book, right?
yeah.
That's great. I mean, it's how often do we have that experience, right? I don't know. Like, just looking at what's behind me, like I guess I know a few of these people, but most
Yeah.
most of those are from, work connections. It's
Mhm.
not like I meet most of my favorite authors, although probably I've met more than most people have.
Yeah. I mean, I'm lucky that I grew up in this like weird city where a lot of like where people have historically come to create things. Like maybe less so
Sure.
now than when I was like a little kid back in, I don't know, the 1830s or whenever it was I was a kid here in New York. Um, because the economics of the place have changed pretty radically. But because I'm here in New York, there's so many writers and artists who either have lived here or have passed through. Um, that I've had the opportunity to meet and hang out and befriend and cultivate longer relationships
Mhm.
with a great many people, both just by being here and doing things like for years and years I ran a literary magazine with the terrible name Lungful that kind of came out of that was inspired in part by sort of performance poetry in the 90s and things like that. And the overarching idea of Lungful magazine um, was that we printed people's rough drafts in addition to the final version, so you could see the process from start to finish.
That's
Um,
cool.
and that emerged initially out of I have through most of my grown-up life, I've run various reading series. And oftentimes people would get up and be like, "Oh, okay, so I wrote this piece on the subway on the way here," and it was, it was okay, but it was, and they were very much leaning into the William Blakean um, edict of first thought, best thought. Yeah,
Mhm.
that whatever you write is fantastic. Don't mess with it. But sometimes messing with it probably would have served them well. And speaking as somebody who spent like 20 years editing the poems in this in this book, like I'm a firm believer in yes, first thought, best thought, like write uncensored and just let it all out, and then over the days and weeks and years that follow, go back and cross out pretty much the entire poem and rewrite everything.
Mhm.
So the Lungful magazine was a way of encouraging people to be aware of the process and the craft behind their own work. Um, but it was also like that was the stated kind of reason behind it. The ulterior motive of both Lungful magazine and running these various reading series was to meet interesting people and have interesting experiences, and on a sort of personal level of just like hanging out in small groups or just one-on-one, um, and uh, and that's sort of served me pretty well to for the last many decades.
And I suppose that either, depending on your perspective, demystifies or remystifies the experience of making art. Demystifies in the sense that, oh, the people creating art that I love are going through a process similar to me.
Mhm.
And then remystifies it in as much as like, oh, and that same spark that's in them also is in me, right? Like
Yeah.
it's, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's demystifying or remystifying.
Oh, I mean, one of the like when I was in my 20s, I wrote a small collection of sort of sonnet-sized poems that and it ended up getting published in like a handmade chapbook, like just a small, like a short book, like saddle stapled, of like 24 or 36 poems. And it was called the Address Book. And each poem, the title was an address, and it was ostensibly like these were like a street address, were notes that I left on various people's front doors. And and the poems themselves were direct addresses to the people who lived, various friends or people I admired or actively did not admire, and like messages to them. And and so that was, that was an example of like a direct, like using the poem itself as a direct form of expression or communication or contact with another individual person. And and at the same time that I was doing that, I was aware of the fact that Frank O'Hara, one of the kind of preeminent founders of what came to be known as the New York School, which was kind of a tongue-in-cheek, by the way, um, 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 name for a sort of loose affiliation of entourages and friends, and other practitioners. It wasn't like an official movement or anything like that, and not everybody was in New York. But Frank O'Hara has a sort of an ars poetica, kind of a statement of aesthetics and poetry, called Personism, a Manifesto, which itself was sort of a tongue-in-cheek um, satire of the whole notion of creating an ars poetica. Um, and uh, and and in it, he was writing in the 1960s. He talked about using a poem as this like method of contact with another person at a time when, at that time you could easily pick up the phone and call the person, but instead you decide to sit down and engage in this sort of more meditative practice of writing a piece that they will at some future point become aware of, that exists, that has their name in it or is clearly addressed to them. So he called that personism. Um, and and um, and then he said a whole bunch of dirty things, which you can look up if you want, um, and
Sounds
which is pretty great.
pretty fun.
Frank O'Hara is such a wonderful wonderful writer. Um, and but uh,
And
but I now, yeah, I
well,
find myself having gone on a tangent, and I don't really remember what the point of departure was, but
you
it's
were getting
okay.
close to reading something, but I was just going to say, I think that very often the most particular messages that we find in poems are, oddly enough, what become the most general. Like the fact that someone experienced this with someone in particular,
Mhm.
had this feeling on a date and in a place. I often find that, when you reach for that universal, sometimes you miss it. But when you
Yeah,
just reach for, here's a particular thing that happened to me, surprisingly, that can connect with people the most. I find that some of
yeah,
the fun,
much more so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, reaching for the universal is the quickest way to like just make a poem not do anything at all.
yeah.
If you're trying to make it do everything. Um,
Well, it's
uh,
probably true of all kinds of art. I mean, I feel like novels
yeah,
do that all the time too. They overreach.
yeah, which is kind of why like Dan Brown works so well, because he's just doing a very specific thing. It's it's not highfalutin. Um,
Well, would you
but
like to read perhaps
sure.
sample
Yeah.
for us anything that you feel like?
Yeah, I'll read. I've got two poems I sort of picked out that might work, and I'll read one, and then we'll see what the vibe is, whether I should keep going with that or if we should move on to something else.
All right.
I,
And I'll be listening attentively, and I believe my better half wants me to apologize for what my brother calls my "Sir, do you realize how fast you were going in a school zone" face. Um, That's just my default. I have resting school. Do you know how fast resting, sir? Do you know how fast you were going in a school zone phase?
Yeah.
So I'm sorry
Um,
about that. That's
well, um, well, this let's see, this first poem. I'm kind of, by the way, I should say I am like woefully unprepared for our conversation, like because I didn't know what our conversation was going to be, so I didn't really know how to prepare for it, which
that's
is
me every day of my life. So no
yeah,
judgment.
it's a great state to be in. I was 100% committed to let's do the maps first because the maps are more visually compelling and probably have a wider reach and probably like your Patreon supporters and all the other people watching are going to be like, "Oy, poetry," and they are not going to make it to the second half if we start with poetry. But you
I
know
don't
what?
know. Actually, there's a lot of interest in poetry. I mean, like, I wouldn't underestimate it.
Okay. And that's not me apologizing for my work, by the way. That's just me
No, no.
saying that that I'm aware of the impact of telling somebody, "Oh yeah, what do you do?" And it's like, well, I'm a landscape designer. Oh, cool. What do you do? Oh, I write poetry. I realize how quickly that can like completely demolish a conversation.
Uh-huh. I teach Old Norse online. Try that one.
That's pretty excellent. Yeah.
It's
Um,
similar.
yeah. Well, I write poetry, but I also make handmade fantasy maps.
Yeah.
So
I teach Old Norse online. Oh, I also translate. Yeah, I know.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
believe me, it's probably a similar response for most people.
Right. Um, so this this first piece I'm going to read is and I guess we can talk a little bit about what it's up to afterwards, maybe, or we can just like not. We'll see how the spirit moves us. This first piece is it's actually um, the piece when this book first came out and I went on sort of a sort of poor man's book tour reading from it. This was the piece that I usually ended the reading with. So I figured why not if I'm going to read a couple of pieces, why not start with this one here in our conversation to complicate the notion of endings. Um, so it is you have 10 million new messages. Acts of Domesticity are a street with the same name as the one I grew up on, but in a different city. Or not even a city, but a marker in the woods, a clue just how far from home we are, out for blood, all of it in the world. On the surface of an adaptation is the adaptation's reason, less a terrible idea than an idea of the terrible. What we thought was the sun, but not the one that rises in the morning, more of an afterthought at the end of a long shadow. Training begins well before we were accepted, and one day they will tell us we are prepared and hand us a scroll with a gold stamp and a fancy ribbon that says, "No, you are not," and is also on fire. Um, so, uh, so at the risk of like destroying any possible version of enjoyment of the poem, we can talk about the poem now. It's like, explaining a joke. That
Yeah.
was funny because,
Well,
but, um,
I
but
don't
we're talking, yeah,
I don't know that there's always a way to, this is something that I run into in interpreting ancient and medieval poetry is, I'll read something and someone says, well, what do they mean? It's like, well, they mean what I just said.
right, right.
What
It's
do you,
like, it's an economy of words. Like this has been pared down to
yeah.
the most concise way to express this.
I mean,
Um,
I think that you have a wonderful facility with language, and your images are unexpected, right? Like there is no flow from like, oh, I've heard this somewhere to,
right.
oh, I've heard this somewhere too, right? The sun, not the sun we thought,
Mhm.
right? But the sun that's, did you say an afterthought at the end of a shit? They're like,
Yeah,
who talks about the sun that way, right? It's just,
right.
it's fresh, it's new. Even when I don't immediately know what you mean, it
Mhm.
makes me think,
Yeah.
right? It gives me some kind of an image. And I just think that you're excellent at it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's actually like um, I'm there's a couple of there's a couple of things that I'm like in this piece. I was yes, definitely thinking if I'm going to say something that's been said before. There's really no point to it unless like going back to like the skaldic tradition that you mentioned of making sort of allusions to other things. Um, unless I can kind of allude to something that's been said before without explicitly saying it again, or if I'm going to say it, saying it in a new context that reveals something else about what was originally said. Um, and um, sort of encrypted within this poem is a shout out to to a experimental science fiction writer named Samuel Delany, who he wrote in 1975. He wrote a totally crazy out to lunch book called Dahlgren, um, and and a bunch of other books and a bunch of books on writing. And he talks about complicating the sun as as a sort of opening gambit within some of his work.
Hmm.
And like with an opening line in one of his books, like the sun rose red, and the other rose blue. Um,
Oh, cool.
and
Hmm.
and um, and then there's a whole lot of like sort of saucy sexual subtext within his work too. So it's very worth investigating on a lot of different levels. So Samuel Delany, and uh, and also there's anytime the sun comes up in a poem, I'm immediately reminded of a Frank O'Hara poem called A True Account of Talking to the Sun on Fire Island, where which is a great poem. It's really useful for like teaching poetry to kids because it's a poem that directly it recounts a an experience where the poet wakes up and the sun is scolding him for having slept so late, and doesn't he know there's like a lot of work to be done. And it's also a fantastic poem. So there are a lot of kind um, of encrypted shout outs within almost every one of these poems, where if you don't notice them, it's not going to take away from your experience of the poem at all. But if you do notice them, um, if you read one of my poems and you're like, I wonder if doing that was a reference to this other thing that happened, it probably is. Or even if
Okay.
it's not, I'll take it. Um, and
Well, I like that, the encrypted shout outs. I mean,
yeah.
I do it too.
Mhm.
In translation and in my own limited original work, I do a fair amount of that. Just, some image that saw somewhere, just two words put together in a way that I thought was memorable. I mean,
Mhm.
and of course, outlaw country bands do this to each other all the time.
Yeah.
They take just a line from somewhere deep in the B side of somebody else's song and throw it into
Mhm.
theirs just so it's like, oh yeah, we listened to you.
Yeah. 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 Speaking of like musicians, this shirt I'm wearing,
Oh, I noticed your shirt.
which probably is, I realized as I like put it on this morning, I was like, can I get away with wearing this shirt on this show?
Probably.
Probably not. It's probably like the like grievous, awful cultural appropriation.
Oh yeah,
But it's one of my favorite shirts. I got it in a thrift store in New Orleans, and part of what I like about it is that I can, if anybody's like, "Oh, hey, I like your shirt," I can say I got it in a thrift store in New Orleans and feel really cool. But also, like people will sort of assume that I'm a musician if I'm wearing this shirt
yeah, it does.
instead of a fantasy cartographer poet, which, in the hierarchy of what it is to be cool, musician is like a little bit, it's way up there.
Yeah, that does give you some fiddle playing energy there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
might actually have that shirt. Um, I do or did have a shirt almost exactly like that. Also, very flattered at the description of this as my show. Um, I
Yeah,
mean,
what do we call this?
I don't know.
I mean,
I mean,
you have a great number of followers, you know. Maybe they're all bots, but I probably not.
I don't think so. I mean, it's not on Twitter, so like that all
Yeah,
became bots at
yeah,
some
yeah.
point. But
Um,
um, I,
but I think I mean it is your show, and your show is, you know, it's ostensibly focused on, you know, sort of Old Norse poetry, but and scholarship surrounding that. But it like that may be sort of the germ of it, but it expands out from there because of this really deep curiosity you have based on other episodes of whatever we're going to call it.
that's
Um,
generous of you. Yeah, I mean, it is the channel about Old Norse and whatever else interests me.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So,
Um, but so so one thing about that maybe is not clear in reading um, people are denying the fact that they're bots on the in the chat window, which
what a bot
is
would do.
yeah, exactly. Um, and but what might not be entirely clear, and I'll just kind of like flash it here on the screen, is that I have all of these blank spaces,
Hmm. The
which
caesura is what we used to call it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I still do, but I'm like there's only so many blank stares I can kind of like absorb in the course of a conversation. So I usually call them blank spaces, but caesuras, is it caesura or caesura?
Well, in Latin, it's caesura, right?
Ah,
So I don't know what you say in English, but
right. Yeah. I just learned that that Satan's dog Cerberus is like from the Greek Kerberos, which means spotted, right? You maybe
Kavros, yeah.
so Satan's dog's name was Spot.
Spot. Yeah.
Yeah, which I kind of love.
Things are always a little bit more somehow both more plain and somehow more terrifying when you find this sort of thing out.
Um, but there are these caesures. And I guess it's like the difference between like Celtic tradition and the Celtics in Boston, you know. Like um
Yeah, I guess actually.
um and I had an Irish English teacher in high school who went off about how it was just blasphemy to call them the Celtics. Um and but uh but there are these caesures. And they are they're they're doing this kind of mechanical operation within the work, and in addition to also being sort of an encrypted shout out to Chaucer and to Old English
Hmm.
prosody, um, where you have these pauses within each line. They exist as these chambers where the phrases on either side can react with one another. Like a lot of what my um, well, there's a lot of my work has an operation where I'll take a phrase and extend it in a way that counteracts the original meaning of the phrase or weakens it in a way that's useful in some way. Like I'm not afraid of you, you know, very much, like something like that.
Hmm.
Or you know, my luck has run out for cigarettes and never came back. You know, something like that.
Yeah,
And and so these blank spaces are moments where kind of the reader can get themselves involved. Like in that blank space, it's like a carburetor where the gasoline of the first phrase and the oxygen of the second phrase are mixed together with a spark.
so, by the way, there's an Old Norse phrase for exactly that because they do this in Skaldic poetry sometimes too, where there's like a line break or something, and then you realize that the word in the line before doesn't mean what you thought it meant.
Oh yeah,
You know,
what is that?
two honens. So it's called revhorf in Old Norse. It's fox vanishing, right?
Fox
The
vanishing?
fox is
Oh,
jumping
fox
down its
vanishing
hole.
down the hole.
You know,
Ah, I love it.
yeah.
That's so vivid. That's amazing. And I have immediately forgotten the word. And you can say it about 10 more times, but I'll email you afterwards so I can have a written version.
I'll put it in chat if you want to see it. Rev
Okay.
revhorf.
Yeah, that as as an American idiot, seeing it written now, like has actually performed the same operation that it performs in a poem. It now has vanished itself from my mind. But I am I'm gonna capture it and uh and kind of look into it a little bit more. But I love that concept
I'll
so much.
I'll send you some examples because right now, I'm actually translating Snorri Sturluson's Hottetal, part of his prose edda, in which he explains how to write Old Norse poetry. This is why these terms like this are at the tip of my tongue. And
Right.
he gives a ton of examples of this, and it's bonkers the levels they take it to.
Okay, I definitely want to see that, and I want to find out if it turns out everything I've already written everything I've written has already been written in Old Norse, and there's no reason for these poems to exist. Then I'll be
Well,
like,
that's not the message to take here. I
uh,
just think that it's interesting that like there's a continuity there, right? And some
yeah,
people might not realize this, a notion that had been practiced by someone 1,000 years ago.
and so much of like when I was first reading Gertrude Stein and really not understand, like I was reading her, like the very first poetry reading I ever went to was a marathon reading of The Making of Americans, which is a it's an epic modernist poem. And and I was bewildered. I had no idea. My mom took me to it, and I had no idea what was going on. It was at a gallery a few blocks from the house I grew up in the West Village in like the 70s. And like talk about bonkers. Um but within it, there were all these things happening that I then came to kind of accept as sort of like signposts of the possible. Like, okay, she did this in her work, which kind of made this construction exist in a way that became visible for anybody who came along this path later on as something that they could use as sort of a starting point in their work or as sort of an encrypted reference within their work or just as a signpost of like, oh, this way of approaching consciousness or language is possible. So it's available to you now. Um,
Mhm.
so that's what I love about all like everything like all of these books back here, they're all of these like signposts of the possible.
And and I think those signposts are incredibly important. I feel like you can tell when you meet artists or writers who have not seen those signposts.
Yeah.
Um, so I remember I used to work at this little museum in Wyoming, and I was going to try to have a cowboy poetry day at
Hmm.
this museum. It was just this random idea that I had. And so I started calling cowboy poets in Wyoming to see if they would come and like read some poetry. And I called this one guy who I guess will remain nameless. And he was pretty interested, but I made the mistake of saying, I've had some poetry published myself. And his first like this before the words come out of my mouth, it's like, does it rhyme? And I'm like,
That's a response.
Like no. And he just like goes off on me and like, oh, this stupid bullshit that people today do and whatever. I'm like, man, Walt Whitman
Right. Right.
died a long time before you were born.
And a lot of things have happened since as well, before and after.
Yeah, right.
Um,
It's like
yeah.
what kind of like you you missed that this didn't exactly start in 2014, man. Like what
Right. Yeah. Like once written language became a thing, people didn't need to rhyme epic poems in order to memorize them.
it was just but it was like so instant, like, oh man, like I'm gonna catch you, you
But
whippersnapper.
that was, I think, in part like one of the many sort of impetuses behind like the beat movement was a reaction against just that. Like, oh, is it a villanelle? No? Okay, then it doesn't count. Well, actually, that's not that's not how humans really typically use language. So why don't we do it this way instead? Um,
Right. Well, and these standards change,
yeah.
so fast in historic terms.
Mhm.
like acting as if you have some objective
Mhm.
as if you have some objective test for the beauty of a written work is just absurd to
Right.
me.
Right.
But that's the
But
knee-jerk reaction of some people.
right. But also there's also there's a change in conception in what the formal techniques are. Like what counts as a sonnet now is very different than when Petrarch was mapping it out, or and 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 the structural rigidity of formal constraints is, unless you're using it as sort of an exercise or as a formal constraint that can be really useful and interesting to kind of put up boundaries on what you're allowed to create, to see what happens, like how that distorts your language in interesting ways, um, is is the fundamental nature of a sonnet, at least to my way of thinking. And this is through a filter of seeing how throughout the 20th century and into the 21st people have approached and complicated the sonnet, is is um, a sort of there's a trifold structure of setting up an idea, expanding it, and then having the fox jump in the hole of
Mm.
turning it in some way that recontextualizes what's happened so far. So there's that sort of that three-part structure, and that exists in a lot of um, a lot of other writing traditions, Western and otherwise. And so there's that structure, and then there's also the sense of like a curvaceousness to it, a movement in that's not linear. And and so like a lot of the works in this manuscript that's coming along are conceived with that notion of a sonnet.
Mm.
I also, as a formal constraint, tried to limit myself to 14 lines per piece. Some of them are a little more, a little bit less. But so it's a very loose, they're very loosely based on the original formal conceits. But they retain that structure of kind of curvaceousness to them. And that's probably true of the sort of shortish poems in this book as well. Um, but uh, but yeah, objective notions of what's good and bad. Like I look at it more in terms of, is this doing something?
Mhm.
Um, and if it's not, if I would have been better served by, you know, organizing a block party or inventing clearer signage for a mass transit system, then I should have been doing that instead of reading some warmed over thing.
I do like that bar that you set, right? Is this more worth spending your time on than, well,
Yeah,
those may be lofty goals, but yeah,
yeah,
taking a shower or something, yeah.
right. I mean, I last year I did a Zoom reading. It was a group reading, and it was my first experience with the Zoom bombers. Um, and and it was startling and disorienting. But at the same time, I was like, oh, okay, this is actually setting a really high bar. Like, if this poem I'm gonna read is not gonna be able to compete what's happening in that other window, and the things that were happening in various windows at the time were pretty extreme and
Well,
and distracting and compelling in their own somewhat upsetting ways, if you weren't ready for it. It's like, well, if my poem is not going to be able to operate on at least that level, then maybe I shouldn't be reading them because
also, webinars on Zoom. You control who's on screen.
yeah,
It has its
yeah,
place.
yeah.
I'd like to hear another reading and talk about maps a little bit. We've gone
Okay,
fairly long. Could I propose we take an intermission,
sure.
a few minutes, and come back? All right. I'm going to pause recording and could we come back uh 55 minutes after the hour?
Yeah, absolutely. Should I log myself off and then
No,
come
no,
back?
no. Just I'll all right, I'm back.
Okay, let me get all my windows up and running. so we can talk a little bit about the maps. I just wanted to say, should I include anything in the chat? Like I was sort of looking up like lists of poets who fall into these different kind of associations
Yeah, if you
that
would like
I
to
touched on.
provide some lists
Um,
or something for someone who wants to follow up on it.
yeah, here's a list of language poets if I can get it to go. There we go. There's a list of language poets. Now, and because this is less a movement or an organization and more kind of a loose affiliation and list of sort of associated poets, there is a great deal of of overlap between people who would identify as language poets or people that we might associate as language poets, and as opposed to New York School or Beat or none of the above. Um, many of like many writers and artists alike might be pegged as existing within a certain tradition, and might say, actually, no, that's a misreading of my work. Like I'm outside of any of those traditions. I like the all of these traditions, but I'm my own person, and I'm doing my own thing. Like we all like to perceive of ourselves as doing something that is sui generis. Is that the
Yeah,
term? I'm not sure.
of its own kind. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But uh, but we are all historically situated, and we all do emerge from like the set of what we've been exposed to and our responses to it. And but
And we don't always acknowledge what those are, or and sometimes we're not that conscious of what they are. You
yeah,
know, one of a friend of mine jokes often about how, every band that you ever hear about, you ask what their influences are, they start name dropping the same like top five bands. Right?
right, right.
It's like what?
So hey, why don't we maybe we'll segue from speaking of bands, segue from talking about poetry that probably most people in their right mind would be like, okay, I can handle about 10 minutes of talk about poetry before I want to just like eat my own eyelids or whatever, just get out of the room. And
Uh,
we managed to like kill a whole hour talking about it. Hopefully it was engaging enough
I think so. I think there are more people who tune into this channel that are interested in this kind of thing than you might expect.
yeah, yeah, I think actually because
I'm not going to say it's the population of New York City. Yeah. But there's people out there who are interested in this sort of thing. I mean, I deal with this I was just talking yesterday to another friend of mine, um, and we both make our livings talking about relatively obscure subjects on YouTube. He
Mhm.
talks about historical firearms. I talk about historical languages and literature in them, and
Yeah,
they both sound pretty obscure.
yeah,
And the fact is, you're not going to meet that many people walking down the street who care about muskets, and you're not going to meet that many people walking down the street who care about Old Norse. But you
right,
add all together those people all over the planet, and it's a fairly substantial number of people. And the suits never understand that.
right. But we all do exist within, like, unbeknownst even to ourselves, within these Venn diagrams. Like, I'm probably more curious about muskets than I realize.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
and especially
we are.
if I have somebody who is like who's really like switched on by a subject, and that curiosity, it becomes infectious.
Yep.
And you walk away and you're like, why is it only now that I'm realizing that like old Norse skaldic traditions is really it's what my life needs to be about now.
This happens to me all the time. I mean, we have a book club where, different people suggest a book each time, right? It's never the same person. We just take whatever nomination from whoever's turn it is. So I
Mhm.
wound up reading things that I never in my life would have thought about picking up and reading. And sometimes it really affects you. It's like, that's a
Yeah.
perspective I hadn't considered. These are facts I didn't know about. This is an entire history I didn't know about. This is a
Mhm.
profession I didn't know existed. Um,
Yeah. Um, so so why don't I share my screen?
yeah, you should
Um,
be able to.
let's see. Let me find out if I am. Let me see here. Hang on one second. Let me move a few things around. Um, and more share. Share screen options. Okay, that's not what I wanted.
This
Okay,
definitely sounds like me trying to share my screen too. So,
I think I may have it.
okay.
Let's see what happens. Share. Share. I command you to share.
Okay, I see a
Machine.
map.
Okay. This is a this is a map of so this is a map of a musician named Jeff Buckley, a singer-songwriter who was active in the 1990s, died in the late 1990s. Some of your viewers may know him, some may not. And and I figured I'll show this map, and you can probably see on the side of my screen I have a couple more queued up. And and I'll get into Jeff Buckley in a minute, but first just the sort of like an overall picture that that people think of maps as being these objective scientific tools. And I mentioned this a little bit actually in the class that Jackson that you were in, um, that 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 they're designed to connect travelers to what's important to them, to what calls to them, whether you're making a map for the Dutch East India Company navigators to find new trade routes, or just like a place to get a nice cup of tea for somebody on vacation somewhere.
Mhm.
Um, the maps are going to be different. They're going to highlight different things. And and they are going to represent things that are not necessarily just geographic. Like maps are always conceptual tools, and they can be used to depict certainly geographies, but they can also be used um, to depict stars in celestial charts and theology, spirituality, statistics, even politics, Venn diagrams of different kind of associated groups, and and always with an eye to the different um, relationships between all the different elements. They're essentially storytelling tools,
Mhm.
and and in fact, there is definitely a tradition of trying to accurately map geography so that you can travel without any sort of impediments. But there are examples, plenty of examples of of maps from the last 2,000 years, especially medieval maps that were designed for like theological storytelling, where they might depict a region where a lot of different things happened in various theological systems, but the emphasis placed on different things, it'll distort the geography for the purposes of the narrative.
Sure.
So
You're thinking about like maps of the Holy Land
yeah, oh
that
yeah,
have
exactly.
more narrative than they are in navigation. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. And and um and they're designed to like provide solutions, as with anything designed, solutions to a problem or a question. Like, and the question can be as simple as like, okay, I'm in Brooklyn. How do I get to New Jersey? You
Mhm.
know? And I've already decided for myself that I need to go to New Jersey for some reason, but I just need to know how.
Mhm.
The why is a whole other, ontological, epistemological dilemma. And or oh, there's a blackout in New York. How do I get the electric grid back on? It's my job to bring the electricity back up to speed, something like that. So I need a map of the electric grid of the Northeast,
Mhm.
something like that. Or something like in Dante's Inferno, I need to be able to explain to all these terrible sinners in my flock, how bad all nine circles are. So here's a diagram that they can understand. Um, and 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 so in the maps that I draw, um, the this series that I've been working on for the last several years has been taking the work of poets and musicians and essentially translating them into these geographic forms. And I began the series during the height of the pandemic as a way of kind of figuratively inviting these people who I really admired and work I enjoyed, inviting them into my home at a time when nobody else could come over. And and I drew a couple of them. The first two I actually drew were John Ashbery and Gertrude Stein, who have kind of come full circle from being like a 10-year-old who was like, "What is this? I barely understand normal writing. What are they doing with this?" To really appreciating and having them sort of at the center of my own sort of theological system. Um, and I drew maps of their work, and without any real intention of what I was doing aside from just enjoying this and using it as a kind of meditative practice to kind of re-see their work in a new way. Posted them both online, like on social media, and people immediately responded to them, making me realize that they could do more than just act as ways for me to meditate on these people who I admire, and it could actually create conditions for other people to enjoy the work in a new way. Um, and so I started making hand cranked letterpress prints of this series, and I expanded the series. It's now, I believe, 17 different musicians and poets, and and like a lot of you will immediately recognize sort of Tolkien's fingerprints on this visual language that I've been using. And but Tolkien himself was engaging in a tradition that already existed. Like he was the first to admit that he really just wanted to create a world, Middle Earth, and all of that in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Um, to create this other world. And he made maps of his realms first, and then after making the maps, developed stories to go with it. The storyline, the characters, was all secondary to the map that he made before anything else, and the lore surrounding it. And but the tradition that his map making kind of emerged out of. Was he said he was inspired by medieval cartography of like storytelling maps. And in fact, I think earlier iterations of the maps that accompany his books were distorted in a way that medieval maps were much more so, and made a lot less geographic visual sense when you were looking at it trying to track, Frodo's voyage
That's
from the
cool.
Shire to Mordor. Um,
That
and
that would be interesting to see. I had never heard
yeah,
that. Mm.
and but he was interested by medieval maps, and also by William Morris's 1897 book, The Sundering Flood. Um, like I think he specifically cited that book as inspiration for him, but he was probably also inspired by Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which was in 1883, and before that Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels, in the 1700s, 1726. And those books pulled from traditions that predated that. You can kind of trace this sort of like handoffs or sort of like walking path from signpost to signpost, of one tradition or approach to another, all the way back to um, like you can trace it directly almost all the way back to like 200 BCE, to I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Eratosthenes. He was
Eratosthenes, I think is how people say it in English. Yeah,
Yeah,
I know what you're
yeah,
talking
that's just, it's all subjective. Nobody knows for sure. I completely defer to your scholarship. Um, but he was the chief librarian at Alexandria,
about.
uh, and wrote this 3-volume opus, magnum otis reading, um, called Geography, where he laid out or expanded theories that already existed, that the Earth was a sphere. He calculated the circumference of the Earth like really accurately, um, and uh, and suggested there were different climates as you worked your way to the poles, um, and uh, and created this map of what was then the known world with like 400 points of interest that Ptolemy, like 300 years later, um, expanded to about like 8,000 points. Um, and and so from there, so these maps, not to say that my maps are, the where all of this was headed, but but the maps that I'm making are sort of pulling from all of these traditions,
Mm.
and couldn't exist without the existence of this sort of like branching through line. Um, and so the the challenge with this map of Jeff Buckley, again, singer-songwriter in the 1990s. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, beautiful, angelic voice. Um, and he was kind of emerged as a singer-songwriter in the East Village around the same time that I was living in the East Village. And so like he and I would cross paths and hang out. And and so I was a great fan of his work, and I liked him as sort of an acquaintance, friend, guy I saw around the neighborhood and would hang out with. And the the uh, the challenge with this map, where I've taken phrases of like titles of songs and fragments of lyrics and turned them into these geographic forms, that um, was that he didn't record a whole lot before he ended up drowning in a sort of tributary river leading to the Mississippi, near Memphis, and and so he didn't have a lot of recorded work, so it was sometimes difficult to sort of fill the map with things that really aligned with what I wanted the geography of the map to depict. Um, so so here we have this map, and then on the flip side, there's this Walt Whitman map where Walt Whitman um, has a huge body of work, and so much of it evokes like evokes specific places and specific geographies.
Mhm.
So whereas with the Jeff Buckley map, it was difficult to figure out, what can I include from like or like where else can I pull material from to make this feel like a fully realized place. With the Walt Whitman map, the opposite was true, where there was so much of his work that evokes such a strong sense of places that could exist on a map. What am I going to pare away? Um, and and so this map is a little bit more dense than the Jeff Buckley map. Um, and and again, these are all just to give you a sense of the scale of them. They're all about like 9 by 12 is the scale that I've sort of created these, and then made small editions of 50 or 100 prints, that are letterpress, which like on an old like hand cranked letterpress machine. So it has this like the original is just pen and ink on archival paper, and the prints are have that kind of wonderful letterpressed embossed texture, where if you run your fingers across it, you'll feel sort of the indentations wherever the ink is. Um,
Yeah, those are really cool. I don't have one of your maps. I don't know what you mean about the embossing. And that's
yeah.
about the size of the map that you had us make in the class.
Yeah, it's roughly the same size. The map in the class that I teach, through Uncommon Goods, is when you take my class, everybody who takes the class is issued an 11 inch by 14 inch template that has the a blank cartouche. That is, the upper left hand corner has a sort of a scroll where the title will be. The cartouche is sort of the title plate, and then in the lower right-hand corner is a compass rose, which is can be a little bit tricky to draw. So I kind of fill that in for the students, so you don't need to stress out about it. And then I walk you through the process of the I teach a couple of different classes, but they're both very similar. One is designed to help you and your partner map out your romantic life together. Hopefully romantic, and but the life that you have built and shared together, where mountains often will be sort of crowning achievements, like moving in together, getting married, and so forth. and deserts and marshes can be like struggles that any life has its fair share of. Some have their unfair share of, and and then other things represent different things. It's kind of up to the people in the class to determine what it is that they want, like what if there's a system that they want to develop for themselves of like, okay, lakes are going to be hopes and dreams for the future, or maybe lakes will be just like music we like, you know. And and then oftentimes I'll encourage the students in the class to have two rivers flowing through their realm, one with each one of your names. Um, I think there have been some people in the class who it hasn't just been couples, it's been like polycules or whatever, and so there's multiple rivers. I've taught the class now for about 4 years, I think. Like it started towards the end of the pandemic, like the real dark era of the pandemic, um, and
And did
and
that come from you getting attention for your maps? And then did you approach Uncommon Goods? Did they approach you? How did that come together?
Um, I I knew somebody who worked at Uncommon Goods, and and the initial plan was, hey, maybe you can sell your maps through Uncommon Goods, and we sat down, and we kind of talked it through, and they were like, actually, instead of doing that, why don't we have you teach classes? Because at that time they were just starting to teach class. They had I think my class was like one of three classes that they were offering. They now have this like full plate of classes that some of them are more sort of have more longevity than others. Like they have like various mixology classes and tarot reading and things like that. Um, and and so now I think they have something like 40 different courses they offer or standalone classes they offer. And And so the initial plan, my initial hope was, oh, I'll sell maps through them. But then we ended up doing the class instead, and the class has been so wonderful. It's like just been so much fun, like getting to meet people. Nobody's like you, Jackson,
Well,
but various interesting people, and and oftentimes, you know, during it's a 90-minute class. At the end of the 90 minutes, we all go our separate ways, and I never see anybody again.
hmm.
But sometimes people will kind of circle back, and we'll keep in touch, and it's kind of lovely because like ultimately the maps people are that I'm teaching people how to make of their lives, it's a very personal kind of intimate experience. You know, whether or not I end up seeing their final map or hearing the the way that they're conjuring ideas of what to put into their map. The fact that I'm they're inviting me into this aspect of their lives is kind of moving to me. That they're like doing this, that they're trusting me and the experience enough to allow this to unfold. Um,
And I have no idea how Lauren came upon it, but she gave me your couple's relationship map making class as a Christmas gift.
yeah, I'm so glad that she did. And I think it's not really something that most people would come up with on their own.
Yeah, so I don't know if
And
I don't know where she found it. I mean, I like maps, so
yeah.
um,
And even somebody who maybe likes maps would come across it and be like, I don't know that I want to put myself into this position for 90 minutes. I don't really know what I'm getting myself into. And it seems very weird.
I don't
So
know.
it
I
takes
thought
a
it seemed
certain kind of
fun.
person. Yeah.
And
And
we still have our relationship map. And then I don't know if I ever actually showed you the relationship map, but
I don't
then
think, yeah.
two
But
months later, working on the second edition of the Poetic Edda, she had mentioned to me all the things, she decided bravely to read the first edition and tell me
mhm,
what it was missing. And she said, I don't know where anything is because I don't have a map. I
yeah.
said, well, I don't know that I like any of the maps that are available, and I would need to kind of combine the real world with the mythic world. And I thought, well, I guess I'll just do it because I did take a class in this. So,
You're an expert now. So in yeah, Old Norse cartography.
hey,
And
it made a difference because I mean, yeah, look, I could have squiggled on the
100%.
page,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
you know, this is what you do first. This is, the relative scale of things. This is how make it look good. Uh,
Yeah.
this is how you come up with random borders, right? I mean, your trick for that is amazing. I don't know if you want me sharing that or not,
Yeah, yeah, by all means.
but just spilling coffee beans on the page and drawing around
Yeah.
it. I mean,
I
that's
mean,
so,
that was an idea that I stole from somewhere who probably stole it from somewhere.
yeah,
It's
it's brilliant because I mean, it makes a real looking coastline. Uh,
yeah.
and so that's how the borders of, Jotunheimar came together on my map, is just from spilling coffee beans on it.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun to do, and I just spent one entire day just in the map making zone on that. And I was amazed that my publishers decided to throw it in, but they did. So it's a fun little bonus in the book now.
Yeah. And and there have been other instances. I by the way, I cannot wait to see your book. I need to like
About one
pre-order.
week, I'll send
Yeah.
you. I'll send you one. I said
Oh,
I'd send you one.
thanks.
So I have the only copy right now, but
Yeah.
it'll
Yeah,
be out in about a week. I will send you one.
yeah. You have the advance. That's your reader's copy.
Yeah.
In another few years, going to be as destroyed as this, maybe. Or perhaps you'll that particular copy you'll keep in better shape.
I usually don't keep my own books. I seldom have a copy, even like a copy of my own books. One of the few exceptions to that is a few years ago, my publisher made a box set of my translations, and that was
Oh
all
wow.
numbered and signed. So I
Yeah.
have the first one of those. Even that's relatively abused. So I'm just if I need to use a book or if I like a book, I play full contact reading with it. So
Yeah. I am 100% the same way. And I'm also the same way with my shirts. Like
yeah,
this is a black shirt, which is why I've been able to hang on to it for as long as I have. But I have two map commissions that I'm working on right now.
okay.
And 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 they're sort of on a very high shelf, like off to the side there. And like as far out of harm's way as possible. Like I've never spilled anything on a map that I've been working on. Like this is my work table over here.
Hmm.
And I have a very short table over here where I keep all my beverages so that if they spill, they're pre-contained.
That's a good
Um,
idea.
on a lower surface than anywhere else. So even if it's a big spill, it's not gonna. Um, so but while I'm working on a commission, I live in fear of doing something incredibly dumb and having to start over. Um,
That makes sense. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, for
And
something that is going to, in its original form, be delivered to the recipient.
and and you were talking about how like, placeless everything feels these days because of we live in this sort of on-screen digital capacity to such a large extent. Um, like the, making a physical object. Certainly making it like a one-off or with these maps like very small editions of prints that are each made individually by hand um, is a really sort of special operation and also a really stressful one because until it's complete, especially once I'm adding ink, I'll pencil everything in, compose it in pencil, um, make sure I've got all of the places where I want them and all the words spelled precisely correctly. Once I start inking, if if I mess up, I was going to put it into like the past. I can't even like conceptualize how the anguish I felt when I have messed something up, like 10 hours into working something and then realize I've, misspelled Walt Whitman's name or something along those lines. Um, Knowing, oh, okay, so I've wasted, the last 3 days
Yeah.
of work. Um,
Oh, I know the dread. And I had, just in preparing the map for the book, I had that experience because I looked at it in pencil and I thought, this looks pretty good in pencil. Am I going to mess this up when I ink
Right.
it?
As long as it's in pencil, you can always erase anything that
Yeah,
goes wrong. But once it's in ink, it becomes much more challenging. Um, but having said that, I mean and having said I was cursed at the very beginning of the show, I'm also like blessed that I get to that I've sort of over the course of years, I've stumbled into these sort of parallel practices of writing poetry and making these maps where there's so much overlap and where one informs the other. And I love making these maps, both making the maps of poets and here's another one just to keep things visually interesting on screen. This is Emily Dickinson, where um, again she she has so much of her work that's devoted to more sort of allegorical voyages and she mentions um, specific geographic features and continents and realms, but
Mhm.
they're evoking specific ideas rather than being, actually like crossing Brooklyn Ferry in like Walt Whitman's work.
Mhm.
And but but I love the kind of the meditative practice that it forces me to sink into, where I'm reading everything that Dickinson wrote, or I'm listening to everything that Jeff Buckley or David Bowie or Joni Mitchell ever composed, and pulling ideas out of that. Like so many, just as the those caesures act as kind of a carburetor between the like create a space um, between two phrases, approaching music or poetry in this visual way sort of creates these two poles, each with its own charge and a space in between for something to happen. Um, like approaching Emily Dickinson through the lens of a map. There's a huge space between that, and within that space, all these other things can emerge.
Mhm. And as a reader, I think that you can look at this map and not only have the appreciation of, oh, I remember where this came from, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's in a way, to me, it seems like a kind of an association engine, right?
Mhm.
I mean, of the three that you've shown here, the one that I'm most familiar with is Whitman, and certainly looking around the maps, like, oh yeah, I remember
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
or I remember something that I've thought about when I read X, Y, or Z, or
Mhm.
uh, and of course yeah, like you said, there's so much of him that you can find
Yeah,
anything.
yeah, yeah. Um, and then in addition to these, I make map commissions both of musicians and writers. I've made some like one-offs that I didn't make prints of. They were just like specific one-offs of musicians that I made as that I was hired to make. And I also make commissions of people's lives together. Like just as I teach them in the classes, I um, I'll people will contact me through my website, and commission me to make maps either of their own lives or of a relative if they're like turning 80 years old and they want to
Mhm.
celebrate the matriarch of the family, or their lives together if they feel like, okay, I don't want to like take the class, or the class sounds great, but I would prefer this guy to actually make the map for me. They can contact me, and then I get to sit and think about these strangers' lives, but think about like the details of their lives in really kind of fascinating ways. And then other people have contacted. I've made maps for people's books, um, and and the sort of the largest commission I've done this year was Radio City Music Hall
Hmm.
um, commissioned me to make a map of they were doing a screening of Lord of the Rings at Radio City where they had stripped away the soundtrack and they had a live orchestra and two choirs providing all the music. It was pretty
That's fun.
amazing.
Yeah.
And they hired me to make a map of New York City, all the different landmarks, but also with overlaid on top of that all the different points of interest within Middle Earth and drawings of some of the characters.
That's cool.
And that was a super fun commission. And and that kind of like goes back directly to like the Tolkien style of fantasy map making.
Yeah,
Um,
full circle. I mean, all the
yeah.
way back to, and I mean, you can certainly see some of that Tolkienian inspiration here. His maps are vaguer. I mean,
Yeah.
you have a lot more detail but yeah, like I recognize this as similar to what he does in the Silmarillion of Lord of the Rings. I hadn't
Yeah.
even, believe it or not, it hadn't even occurred to me that, part of the reason this looked maybe slightly familiar to me was some of his style, but then his style is also similar to illustrations in other fantasy works. And then in a lot of dinosaur books, I don't know if you know this, but this is sort of a popular thing in books about dinosaurs is to have, maps of Pangea or the
Mhm.
continents in the
Oh,
Jurassic.
right, right, right.
And
To show
often, yeah,
why,
and
how come the same fossils are showing up in what's
right.
Pennsylvania and also in like Morocco?
But there are paleontologists like Bob Bacher, for example, who actually really have fun with making the maps and uh, often have sort of Tolkien looking maps in their books.
Yeah. Yeah. And like probably my first like before coming across Lord of the Rings, um, what was it called? The Phantom Toll Booth by Norton Juster had a map by oh now it's evading what my feeble mind. Um, I'm pulling it up right now. Jules Pfeiffer. There we go.
Hmm.
Uh, there's a map of the Phantom Tollbooth is a very wonderfully silly children's book with a lot of um, both linguistic and mathematical puns throughout.
Hmm.
Like I loved it growing up when I read it to my daughter when she was a little kid and it didn't hold quite the strong appeal that it once did because it's just really silly. And at a certain point, the silliness is just like, oh, okay, how many
Yeah,
more
right.
pages? But it has this awesome map by this cartoonist Jules Pfeiffer, who was sort of a countercultural cartoonist in the 60s and 70s, did a lot of work with the Village Voice, um, and uh, and made this really tremendously wonderful hand-drawn kind of map of this crazy imaginary world.
Cool.
And that was sort of my first experience of a book with a map in it. And it really, to be able to read about this little kid's like voyage through this like crazy world and reference what was happening in this chapter with this point in the map
Mhm.
really transformed the experience.
I was just thinking, my first experience with a book with a map is probably Raptor Red by Bob Bacher. I don't know if you've ever heard about that.
I don't think so.
So he's a paleontologist. He was actually like my childhood hero, and weirdly, as an adult, by coincidence, I wound up kind of knowing him. But Raptor Red is his novel about dinosaurs. It is actually told from a dinosaur's perspective and such. It's better than it sounds. But he drew a map that's a lot like that, and it's Cretaceous North America. I've got that somewhere. It's also where my what people tend to think of as my like tagline comes from because when I met him in 1995 and had him sign the book, he wrote all the best. And so that's why I signed off that way for so long and why I signed on videos that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was about 10 years old, I wrote a letter to Norton Juster, who wrote The Phantom Tollbooth.
Hmm.
Um, and just saying, that I loved his book and also saying, I was like 10 years old. I'm also a writer, but I've been experiencing a little bit of writer's block lately.
Oh, that's sweet.
And he very sweetly wrote back. It was sort of like a form letter, kind of the publicist had put together, saying, thanks for writing. It's so nice to hear from people who have read the book, especially, when they actually like the book. Um, and but then there was a handwritten note saying, I'm so sorry to hear about your writer's block. We writers often have that problem, but it passes.
That's really nice.
It was so sweet.
I really appreciate that. I mean, look, to it is hard to work up the courage to write to somebody that you think is that cool, right? And then for him to
Yeah.
write back, especially to a kid, that's really sweet.
Yeah. Um, and And there was somebody in the chat who asked if I felt I needed to be like politically correct in my work. And I was thinking about that like in the background while I was doing all this other talking about other stuff. And like political correctness is like, it's a very loaded term, but like ultimately in my work and in just being a human, I just try to be, compassionate and create conditions for other people to like have expansive like for their lives to be as expansive as possible and so things like writing a letter that I did to this person who I admire, I try to still do that. Like even like I'll do it to, like the people on this shelf, I'll try to reach out to them as much as possible and just to let them know I really, I read your book and I really love it. And, which is great for like a small press book where there's like, 100 copies that are in the world. So
Right.
you've worked really hard on this, and once it's done, it kind of sinks into oblivion. It's nice to hear back that your work is existing in somebody's mind.
But
And
even big authors, I mean, like, yeah, a lot of times someone doesn't have time to reply to you, but even bigger authors often appreciate.
I'm sure.
Well, and part of it too is that bigger authors are often hearing negative stuff pretty often. So
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
just that little shot in the arm from someone who's like, "Hey, really appreciate that you did this," makes a difference. And this
Yeah.
isn't me putting myself in the category of big authors, but I mean like of those that I know, I know that it makes a difference to people. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's completely true. So in terms of being like political politically correct for the sake of being politically correct. I think that's sort of like it's a tricky question, but just being like compassionate and affirming and like encouraging people to live in ways that as long as it doesn't harm other people, but it like brings them fulfillment, then I'm going to try to incorporate as much of that into my behavior and into my work without my work ever being like didactic. I never want my work to be something that can be read as, you should be doing this, or isn't that a bad thing? But probably within the structure of my work and within the ideas that are being expanded and complicated and simplified and converted into foxes. Um, Within that, there is probably an innate sort of moral structure
oh,
that
sure.
that that just comes from a sense of like, you know, we're all on a difficult road here, and as if we can be helpful to each other, then we should be.
Well, and I think that you can read someone's values out of their work
Mhm.
oftentimes without them having to beat you over the head with it. And
Yeah,
that often the attempt to beat someone over the head with it makes it less interesting to read. It's like,
yeah,
well, I don't just need to read about what you think about whatever. Like that, I can go a million places for a think piece,
right. Yeah,
opposite to
exactly.
your art.
And
Yeah.
that's what I think, and I think probably other people can probably perform that function better than I can because I'm focusing so much of my attention on doing this other thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so um,
Well, I mean, like I find myself in that position with like it's weird, but talking about Norse myth and language online, right? I mean, like
right,
people can be, well, there's some surprising interest groups who get really invested in this, but you know, people can want to know what side you're on before they listen to you.
right,
I'm like,
right,
Why do you care? Because
hmm
all I'm trying to do is give you information.
right,
B, you can figure out that I'm not on, this extreme because just the way I talk about things. Uh,
right,
like, why should I have to, give you like a 10-point program of my
right.
religion and philosophy and whatever before I talk to you? Like, to me, that undercuts the fact that I'm trying to kind of give you a break from that.
hmm Right,
Like,
right.
but,
Yep,
well, we have talked a pretty long time.
I
And
know.
And I need to start getting ready to teach my
Yeah,
class
your
pretty
class is
soon.
coming up. Yeah.
So, can I say thank you very much for this conversation, which I've enjoyed just on a personal level beyond, being able to hopefully help present some of your work to the world. And ask where you would like people to find you. Is your website the best place to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think like there's my website. That's probably the best way as like a clearinghouse of information. That makes it sound like a Costco or something, but like probably like if you're interested in either my poetry or my maps or both, website is the way to go.
Okay.
Um, if and I guess you can put that up when you do all
Yeah.
the when you have your team do post-production on
My
your
team. Yeah.
I mean, your
Yeah.
team may be like you put on different ones of those hats depending on what you're doing.
That's basically correct. Yeah. I do all of the editing myself just because, you would have to know Old Norse to
Yeah,
edit most of my videos. By the way, I actually edit everything on my phone. So,
that is a both a Herculean and a Lilliputian task.
yeah, it's both.
Yeah.
Because when I started my YouTube channel, I didn't have a PC. So I just got used to doing everything on my phone. And now it's like, well, I have a PC, but I'm not going to sit here for a day and figure out how to do it. So,
Right. No, I totally get it. But uh but yeah, my website is a good thing and or you can follow me on Instagram if you're part of that whole thing. Where again, lots of poems, lots of maps, and lots of like selfies of me looking just bewildered at what what this life has become.
well, fantastic. Well, thank you, Brendan. And I'll be in touch because we should be talking about poetry stuff some more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jackson. This has been like just such a pleasure. I really appreciate the chance to just get to know you a little bit better and to like talk about these things which are, I think, important to all of us as humans.
Likewise. Well, my pleasure, and talk to you soon. Wish you all the
Okay.
best for now.
All right. Have a great day. Good luck with your class.
Thank you. All
All
the
right.
best.